Before he takes the stage, I should introduce Andrew, who's very kindly come along to talk to us this evening. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome him as our guest speaker. He obviously has a Navy background, as some of you might have heard as you're talking at dinner, and has worked with the Department of Defence for 38 years or so. Apparently starting as a dockyard apprentice and then specialising in explosive ordnance and weapons. As a naval reservist, he rose to become a petty officer Marine Technical and served in attack, Fremantle and Armadale class patrol boats and landing craft. He spent time in the mine warfare world, including work related to minesweeping, drone boats, precise navigation and stonefish exercise mines. His last appointment was as a senior technical advisor in a direct fire support weapon procurement project. Andrew will talk about HMAS Goorangai's deployment, minesweeping in Bass Strait, the circumstances of the collision between Goorangai and HMS and the MV Duntroon. I say Goorangai, I keep calling it that. It's Goorangai, isn't it? Say so. And the subsequent inquiries, search and rescue and salvage, Newport's demolition. He clearly has an affinity for this story, having also had a background with the 1980s reincarnation of the reserve unit where the Goorangai Ship's Company were drawn, Mine Warfare Group 54. Andrew, although some of us have attended the memorial ceremonies for Goorangai at Queenscliff over the years, I sense you have some twists in the tale of this story that will enlighten our members tonight, so welcome.
Okay, so if you know the story of the HMAS Goorangai, it's probably based on a popular story that that was based upon the Melbourne Steamship Company's version of events, which might not be right. The references I've drawn here were from the National Archive, and they were secret until 1992. So any version before 1992 is probably not, maybe biased a little bit towards the Melbourne Steamship Company's version of events. So my version's been accepted by Heritage Victoria, Navy Sea Power Centre, Naval Institute. The Australian Naval Institute is their magazine, and the Australian War Memorial. The loss of the Goorangai had a few unfortunate firsts. It was the first surface ship lost by the RAN. It was the first RAN ship lost within territorial waters. It was the first surface ship lost with its whole ship's company of 24, leaving 13 widows and 13 children without a father. Significant other facts. The collision has resulted in the only known unto God RAN burial. The unknown sailor makes the sailor memorial for sailors without a grave at Hoe in Plymouth, United Kingdom, incorrect. The loss of one sailor is the quickest first day loss of a sailor drafting onto an operation that was Seaman Hack. And he also travelled the shortest distance for his death, 1.5 nautical miles. Conventions on informing next of kin as a result of service were developed after the collision. Many of the families were only notified or indirectly notified of the loss of the Goorangai by reading the newspaper in the morning press The Goorangai was the only commissioned ship salvaged by the RAN. I think that's right, I'm not 100% sure of that. So the steam trawler Goorangai, it was a Castle class steam trawler built in Walsh Island Dockyard in New South Wales, 126 feet long, displaced about 200 tonnes, had a top speed of 9.5 knots, had a crew of between 13 and 14, and it was requisitioned from a fishing company called Cam and Sons. So if you watch TV, there's a fellow called Scott Cam, and so Scott Cam, it was his family's fishing business. So it was requisitioned in September 39, commissioned at Williamstown, October 39. Duntroon. The motor vessel Duntroon was a coastal passenger and general cargo ship built by Swan Hunter Richardson Walker at Newcastle upon Tyne. It was 422 feet long, displaced about 10,500 tonnes, top speed of 16 knots, owned by the Melbourne Steamship Company. This ship is the Penguin. So the whole reason why the Goorangai was in the area of operations around the southern end of Port Phillip Bay was it was clearing minefields laid by German merchant raiders. The Penguin and its auxiliary, the Passat. They laid six minefields in Australia between 28th of October and 7th of November 1940. So it was a pretty tricky sort of strategy they had, because they had two ships. They could place lots of minefields from over quite an area from around Newcastle all around to South Australia and even off Tasmania. So yeah, that was quite a good strategy. Passat minefields laid in the east and west Bass Strait. They claimed the ships of the Cambridge and the city of Rayville. The city of Rayville was an American ship, and there was one sail lost on both ships. And the city of Rayville was the first World War II American sort of casualty. That's the Passat. That's the Passat. So, yeah, so the Penguin came across an oiler called the Storstat off Western Australia while it was in transit from Borneo to Melbourne. The plan was to, as I said before, to nearly simultaneously sow minefields near Australia's southeast cities and choke points using the two ships. Storstat was commissioned as a mine layer auxiliary Passat and modified with a rail launching system and a magazine for the mines. So that's Passat. So HMAS Goorangai, as it was converted to a auxiliary minesweeper. The Castle class trawlers were common in their basic design. They were used they were designed in the UK, but like the Goorangai was built in Australia. They were used for the purposes of trawling, obviously in peacetime, but they were pretty useful auxiliary minesweepers, and were used in both wars as auxiliary minesweepers. They were also used by the New Zealanders and the Canadians, so as well as Australia and the UK. The Goorangi's wartime fit was a 12-pounder gun, 4 depth charges, small arms, and an oripees sweep. So we're talking about the southern end of Port Phillip Bay where all this occurred. So the situation at the time of the collision was HMAS Goorangai was at anchor at Queenscliff for resupply and victuals on the 20th of November 1940. Needed to move to its regular anchorage at Point Nepean, and it started its move at 2000 at its best speed, which isn't very fast. The Duntroon was in Melbourne overnight on the 19th of November. So, sorry. Here we go. The Duntroon was in Melbourne overnight, 19th of November. Sailed Victoria Docks at Dun 17:30 on 20th of November, sailing to Sydney. Entered the South Channel at 2000. The bridge team was Captain Lloyd, 2 bridge watch-keeping officers, a helmsman and a lookout. At 2015, Lloyd sent 1 officer to close down the ship's lighting. Shortly after, Lloyd sent the other officer away to decode sailing instructions for outside the bay. The general conditions at the time, the bay was considered inside harbour, so navigation lights are at normal brilliance, whereas outside the bay, navigation lights are visible for 1 nautical mile through dimming or shading. It was a hot day with a cool change happening at about 20:30, at about the same time as the collision. Visibility was clear, but there was sea mist. The rip conditions are at maximum tide flow between 5 and 7 knots at 18:30, so at the same sort of time, actually it's 20:30. The position of the collision, I don't know if you know the South Channel very well, it's just next to the marker for Pope's Eye.
The way we came in.
There were 13 witnesses to the night collision from Port War signal stations located at Point Lonsdale and Point Nepean. The Royal Australian Artillery had lookouts at Point Nepean as well, and the Point Lonsdale lighthouse keeper, the Port Phillip pilot, in an incoming Japanese merchant ship, the Kitano Maru, and the captain of Duntroon and his watchkeepers were all eyewitnesses. Some of these accounts under cross-examination during the Marine Board of Inquiry, the true story, or from those accounts, the true story can be ascertained. So on the left is the Port War signal station at Point Lonsdale, looking down from the Point Lonsdale lighthouse, and that's how. And on the right is how it is today. the hexagon shape as the signal station, and the lighthouse is the little round section. All right, so this is on the Point Lonsdale side. The arrow shows something called the BOP. It's the Battery Observation Point for the Royal Australian Artillery. Importantly, the three buildings underneath it were accommodation buildings being built at the same time as when the collision occurred, and that produced sand obscuration to the lookouts. So the sand obscuration was so bad that they had signallers in the BOP signalling ships. They'd signal the ships, but they couldn't read the answers. Why you would have someone tolerate that, I'm not quite sure, but it's maybe how the army do things. So the battery observation point on the left is how it was in the 1940s, on the right is how it is today. So the following is an attempt to string all the aspects together and arrive at the real collision story, which will give a better reasoning of how and why the collision occurred. So the Duntroon displaying downward directed dimmed wartime navigation lights, while the Goorangai displayed bright harbour navigation lights. The Duntroon was travelling at 17 3/4 knots, and the captain believed he was overtaking the Goorangai, but instead he was on an unchanging relative bearing, a collision course, and the Goorangai was actually crossing Duntroon's track from Duntroon's starboard side, just very slowly. At a minute before impact, the captain of the Duntroon observed the Goorangai's port navigation light, bearing 1 to 1.5 points off the starboard bow, at a distance of 1.5 nautical miles. And realising the true heading of the Goorangai and the imminent collision, the Goorangai had at the same time sighted the dimmed outline of Duntroon's presence and was using its Aldous lamp to alert Duntroon of its presence. Duntroon's action was to turn to port to bring her engines to stop and turn to port and bring her engines to stop instead of the more logical turn to starboard or even stand on to pass astern of the Goorangai. The reason the captain of the Duntroon had for the turn to port was to give the other vessel a glancing blow on collision. The slow-speed diesel engines of the Duntroon needed more than a minute to enact a stop, and Duntroon still had way on forward when Duntroon's lifeboats were launched, which was 2 minutes after the collision. Witnesses reported hearing some blasts varying in number between 2 and 5 and assumed them from Duntroon, but the Duntroon captain initially said he made no sound signals. Duntroon did not engage its engines astern for a few minutes after the collision because the captain said he did not wish to reverse over the Goorangai wreck or the survivors. The engineering officer commented that the speed they were travelling, many minutes were needed to obtain the astern. So, problems. Seaworthiness. The overall seaworthiness of both vessels was never confirmed. Witnesses, Lloyd, Burford, and the lookout were unreliable. So Burford was the officer commanding of the artillery, Royal Australian Artillery. And Burford, interesting fella. He got promoted. He was a captain at the time, so he was in charge of a battery observation point that wasn't able to see answers to signals, and he eventually got promoted later that year. Later in the war, he was court-martialed for misappropriating something to do with ammunition. It was a lot of ammunition as well. And looking at his service record, 50 years later, in the 1990s, he wrote to records to try to have his court-martial expunged. So he obviously he never accepted responsibility for things. Like everyone makes mistakes, I guess, but yeah. So the causes of the collision were never really well explored. So, for instance, the weather. A ship called the Arungal ran aground at Barwon Heads on the same night, and it was accepted that the reason for it to run aground was because of the sea mist, and it lost visibility of where it was. Thought it was entering Port Phillip Bay, but instead it was running into the Barwon River. Charges on Lloyd changed. So after the Marine Board of Inquiry, he was charged with various things, and those charges changed. I don't know how they changed. I suspect there was an early version of like plea bargaining maybe. The Navy was represented at the Marine Board of Inquiry, but not at the Coroner's Inquiry or Lloyd's show reason inquiry, where he was absolved of all charges. After the collision, the Duntroon eventually stopped and put all its upper deck lighting on and signalled the signalling service that a collision had occurred. 2 lifeboats were lowered to search for survivors. The signalling service advised both the Royal Australian Engineers picket boat, the SS Mars, so that's a Mars there, and the Queenscliff lifeboat. They joined in the search for the survivors after delays to Mars needing to raise steam, and the lifeboat running aground on a sandbar which had formed at the end of the launching rail on the Queenscliff Pier. If you go to Queenscliff Pier, that sandbar is still there. So it was maybe poorly sighted at the time of design. So this is the Queenscliff lifeboat that took part in the search. It was, as I said earlier, it did attend the SS Arungal, so it would have been a pretty busy night for the lifeboat crew. Probably the busiest night they'd ever had. After an hour of searching unsuccessfully for survivors, the Duntroon lifeboats were retrieved and Duntroon returned to Williamstown to have her bow repaired. There was no apparent strategy or control of the search. So the Duntroon lifeboat crew, they talk about how it took all their effort to fight the fight the tide while they were looking, but I would have thought the more logical part to pick someone up in the water might have been to travel with the tide, but there was no apparent strategy in it all. So, ship's company, the crew were members of the Royal Australian Naval Reserve. Some of them, such as the master, were former crewmen from a peacetime role as a trawler. The remainder of the crew were RA&R, many from Williamstown. The remains of just 6 of the 24 sailors killed were recovered from the wreck during the salvage operations in the following months after the sinking. 4 of the sailors, including the unidentified remains of the Goorangai sailor, were buried at Williamstown, and 1 each were buried at Springvale and Cheltenham. One of the sailors' bodies could not be identified. His remains were the last recovered, and he was buried within 24 hours of discovery. These remains were rediscovered and recorded in an unrecorded and unmarked grave at Williamstown Cemetery in 2013. So the empty-looking one is his grave, and this is when the grave had been properly formed, and the Navy put on a ceremony. After obtaining the estimate in money and time of £15,000 and 6 months to complete 3 phases of salvage, the Naval Board was reluctant to devote resources. But the Port Authority required the wreck to be removed as a matter of urgency because it represented a navigational hazard in the South Channel. The original salvage plan was to be a 3-phase evolution. Phase 1 and 2 involved the HMAS Goorangai, and to be used as a diving platform. So the Beryl 2 was the same as the Goorangai. It was a Castle class trawler. On the second day of the diving, the first sailor's body was recovered. Also, the first of 4 Type D depth charges were recovered without incident. The second depth charge was accidentally set to armed. This could have been an added disaster given the pistol setting for the mines were to function at 50 and 80 feet, and the depth of the wreck was 48 feet. The Naval Board approved the change from salvage to demolition after the remainder of the depth charges were destroyed in situ. The Navy thought that they could do a salvage, and they just borrow fishermen's boats at Queenscliff. But no fishermen wanted to lend their boats. So all the Navy could get their hands on were the 2 out-of-date lifeboats. So this was the big lifeboat and the small lifeboat. They were stored at Point Lonsdale. Inquiries. So there was a quick inquiry on the night of the 20th of November and reporting to the Naval Board 21st of November. So quick and dirty inquiry. There's a Marine Board of Inquiry from 5th of December 1940. Had 13 sitting days. lots of cross-examination. So you could have the story, and you could things that were in dispute, people would come back and be cross-examined. Then Lloyd was charged after the Marine Board of Inquiry with various things. So he had set a show of reasons why he should keep his ticket inquiry, and that was early 1941, and it went for no longer than 2 days. And then there was the coroner's inquiry, and that was in June 1941. The quick inquiry was had to get to the basic facts and circumstances, work out who were killed. The sand obscuration was raised then, and as a result of that, the Army did their own investigation, and that was also marked secret, and so not available until 1992. The deaths of the sailors were reported in the press before the families were notified. The Marine Board of Inquiry, Naval Board agreed to the terms of reference, which were identical to the quick inquiry. So there was a bit of naivety from the point of the Naval Board. I guess they thought it was all about trying to find out why the collision occurred, but in the commercial sense, if it was two commercial merchant ships, they're on about who was most liable, and so by agreeing to the same terms of reference as their quick and dirty report, they've done themselves a bit of an injustice. All witnesses except Lloyd didn't observe Duntroon's lights until after the collision. So while Lloyd said that he observed his own lights before the collision, he didn't say when, where, how. Anyway, he was the only one who said that the Duntroon's lights were on, and for some reason was never cross-examined about that. Whereas, for instance, with sound signals, he was cross-examined for over half a day to get out of him that he might have sounded the sound signals, and I think they should have maybe put more effort into that subject as well. There's no engineering perspective of seaworthiness. The Goorangi's lights, there was some unproven theories about the Goorangi's lights. Goorangi's unseen navigation lights by Captain Burford, our mate Captain Burford. So he was pretty tricky. At all inquiries, he said the same thing. He said he didn't see Goorangi's navigation lights. He didn't say the reason why he didn't see them. The reason why he didn't see them was because of the sand in his eyes. However, his signallers did say that they couldn't see things because of sand in their eyes. But whenever there was things like the coroner's inquiry went for 1 day, so it meant that the witnesses could be cherry-picked, and Burford stuck with his, I didn't see the coloured lights of the navigation lights. Lloyd was charged with not keeping proper lookout due to, in the court's opinion, to his sending the officer of the watch into the chart room to decode a wireless message, while his own attention was mainly centred around navigation of the vessel. B, in failing to watch the compass bearing of the other vessel. And C, in not reducing speed of his ship earlier in approaching a situation which was obviously dangerous in view of the presence of oncoming vessels on the port side and the Goorangai on the starboard bow. So the show reasons inquiry on Lloyd's charges. There's no transcript available. I suggested to Department of Transport I put in a Freedom of Information request, and they said there's no point, there just isn't anything, nothing. There was just a 1 page of the outcome of the inquiry, just to say that all the charges were not sustained. Yeah, that's right. The charges from the Marine Board of Inquiry had changed for his show reasons. I don't know how that happened. If there had been a transcript, maybe it would have worked it out. Goorangai's navigation lights faults became fact. So Marine Board of Inquiry, they said, oh, maybe there's something to the navigation lights on Goorangai, but there was no evidence, proof. Lloyd was absolved of all charges. Expert opinion was provided by Lloyd. So that's pretty convenient. So out of all the shipping companies within Victoria, the Marine Board got the expert opinion of the bloke who was charged to provide opinion. The Goorangai lights. So often it comes up about the Goorangai lights, especially at the Memorial Day. So whenever the lights are mentioned, you'll see the shiver go down my spine. Was raised by Williamstown Dockyard Hull Overseer, a fellow called Nicholas, who hadn't acknowledged his conflict of interest with a previous employment with the Melbourne Steamship Company. So the Melbourne Steamship Company had their own maintenance yard that was physically next to the dockyard, called Hobson's Bay Engineering. They had their own slipway, or they had a dry dock that lifted up, pumped it out. He was responsible for the conversion of the Goorangai to a minesweeper, provided no evidence of the shortcomings of the lighting, justifying by scaling measurements from a schematic drawing. The new gun platform obscured. He said that the new gun platform obscured the beam of the side navigation lights, and he claimed there was no drawings of the platform, which I can't believe. The platform supported a 12-pounder gun. The gun was substantial in weight; it would have been about a tonne, but the recoil forces on the gun deck would have been many tonnes. The concept that you just tell a boilermaker to make a platform is just nothing short of unbelievable. There was there was an attempt to theorise Goorangai crabbing, but it was crabbing in its progress across across from Queenscliff to Point Nepean, but it wasn't accepted by the Marine Board. But interestingly, it was the theory was supported by Nicholas, a Melbourne Steamships Company captain and the pilot of the Katana Maroon. Sorry about the drawing, it's a terrible one there. It sort of shows the lights outswung, so at the top it's outswung, and at the bottom the lights are inswung. So the idea that the lights could have been inswung is a bit outrageous, considering the master of the Goorangai had been master of these ships for a few decades, and he'd been crew on them before that. So the idea that he travels around with his navigation lights in the wrong position is pretty doubtful, I would think. So, do we all agree with that these reflect the navigation lights rule? If the yellow is white, do we accept that? And sort of like that from above. So, looking forward, it's the rules say that should be parallel to the centre line of the ship. Okay, you agree with that?
Yeah.
The reality is, there's a bit of a reality check to this. The reality is they're actually pointed a little bit inward. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to see the two lights at one time unless you had a head the width of a ship. You wouldn't be able to see two side lights. So this drawing, interesting drawing. This is the schematic drawing that was presented at the inquiry, and to determine that the navigation lights weren't fully to the width of the ship. This fellow Nicholas, he scaled measurements from this drawing. So it's very bad practice to be scaling from a drawing like this, because the thickness of one line would maybe be a few inches, and he was estimating it within fractions of inches, all right? So to come up with a obscuration. Bit of a thing with ship's drawings. In order to start building a ship, you have a ship drawing like this. It shows you the basic layout of how you want the ship, and off they go and start making it. The end product doesn't necessarily look like this. So they redraw all the drawings for the as fitted drawings, they're called. So the original design drawing might have pumps that are at the far end of engine room, furthest from an electricity supply or pipe work or something. So logically they'll move it to somewhere else. So all that gets taken up with as fitted drawings. And this is just proof of it. So it was for two ships, the Goorangai and the Gunambi. So this is an actual photo of the Goorangai's lights. This is a better photo, not of the Goorangai but another Castle class. So the lights were outswung. They were outswung or inswung because they could inswing them for when they were rebunkering, because the bunkers were just underneath the lights on the main deck. So it meant that they could just barrow the whole load of coal from the wharf into the bunkers. This is the gun platform on the Goorangai. It's an actual Goorangai photo. So that shows the width. It's nowhere near the maximum width of the ship. These things here are called gallows. There's one over here. They're actually at the full width of the ship. Coroner's inquiry. Sailors were not legally represented. The RAN was not represented. The Melbourne Steamship Company took over the inquiry with their selected witnesses. So I don't know how that could happen. I don't know how you could have a coroner's inquiry for particular people and someone else takes over the story of how it all happened. But it did. The obscuration of Goorangai's navigation lights were now fact without any proof. The inquiry didn't meet the standard for a coronial inquiry. The identification of recovered remains, reasons for the deaths. Basically, the reasons for a lot of the deaths would have been because there would have been certainly people from the forecastle party thrust into the water. So the fact that the rescue wasn't very well executed, that should have been talked about in the coronial inquest. The unidentified sailor. So no explanation on how he was recorded, how he was not recorded with the Commonwealth Graves Commission, candidate families not informed, corruption of the coroner's identification process, no payment for the cemetery plot. So effectively he was put in a pauper's grave. The Office of Australian War Graves and Sea Power say it's against policy to identify the sailor without them being able to state the policy name. So on a couple of occasions I did ask them what the policy name was, but they were unable to tell me. So I wrote to DVA with a Freedom of Information request, and they confirmed there was no policy. At first I didn't believe them, so I appealed their advice, because the fellow giving me the advice from Officer of Australian War Graves was a retired brigadier, and I maybe had some confidence that a retired brigadier would tell me the right thing, but obviously he either didn't know or he didn't want to tell me. But as it turned out, there was no policy at all. So I wrote to the Minister of Department of Veterans Affairs, and he stated that there was a policy of the additional Protocol number 1 of the Geneva Convention. The Victorian coroner was asked to reopen the inquiry in 2020. So, additional Protocol number 1, the Geneva Convention. If you think of the reason of the Geneva Convention, it's got nothing to do with people that are Australians and the death happens in Australia. It's got more to do with things that happen overseas. So it doesn't meet the scope of our Goorangai unidentified sailor. So the Minister was wrong as well. Victorian coroner, decision in 2020. The current Coroner's Act was poorly drafted and doesn't allow the coroner to reopen the inquiry from 1941. So usually when they bring in a new act, they honour, it's like a grandfather rule, they honour the things from what's happened in the past. There was some error in the way they drafted the latest act, and so it was left out for 1941. He did have the following determination though, because he kind of knew that the Victorian coroner kind of knew that nobody's ever asked this before, and I've worked out that there's a problem. So he did go to the trouble of making some determination. So from the asterisks, he says it appears unlikely that the consideration was ever given to using the personnel or personal and medical information to assist in identifying the unknown sailor. Had it been done at the time, it is possible that matching some of the information to the remains found may have assisted in determining the identity to the coronial standard of proof. So some compare it to the Sydney sailor. So the Sydney sailor was recently discovered who he was. His identity was determined as a result of the Senate inquiry recommendations in 1998. He was buried at Christmas Island in 1942. Many days after his remains were recovered from a Carly float in a grave not owned by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. He had had an autopsy performed on him before his burial. His remains were exhumed in Christmas Island Cemetery around 2000. His burial on Christmas Island was deemed as battlefield burial, so identification could be performed between Christmas Island exhumation and the eventual burial in Australia. The Goorangai unidentified sailor more closely resembles a battlefield grave than the Sydney sailor. The coroner says identification could have occurred in 1941, but no effort was made. Much like in a battlefield burial, they just bury them on the spot, and identification may happen afterwards. He was buried 24 hours after recovery. Candidate families were not informed. He was buried in an unpaid for grave, not owned by Office of War Graves and Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Navy should assess how leaving the sailor unidentified meets their signature behaviours: honesty, honour, courage, integrity, loyalty. Navy should take steps to remedy the shortfalls of the past with the aim of determining the identity of the sailor. The Senate inquiry option is available, which will harm Navy's reputation. I wrote to the Chief of Navy. He says about the Goorangai sailor, I do, however, hold the view that although it is not permissible to exhume unidentified Goorangai sailor, his final resting place and prevailing unknown status takes on a much broader and important significance. I don't really know what that means, but for the Sydney sailor, Thomas did his duty until hope was forlorn. He faced peril and terror on the open sea. He died alone, but his memory and legacy endure. After 80 years, we will return him the dignity of his name. He also stated, I think it does provide a degree of closure for everybody. So, same Chief of Navy has two very separate opinions of the two. Questions?
I've got one. For many years I've read somewhere that boat ships didn't have lights.
Yeah.
You don't agree with that?
It's not what the 13 eyewitnesses say. It's not.
An urban myth.
Or it's a story that the Melbourne Steamship Company perpetuated because there was no way of validating it against the Marine Board of Inquiry papers until 1992 when they were declassified. Yeah.
So which ship struck the other and on which side?
So the Duntroon struck the Goorangai on the left, on the port side.
So it didn't give way to start.
No.
Fundamental stuff.
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
And even if he couldn't stop, he could have turned.
Yeah, he turned the wrong direction. So you as a skipper, would you have turned that way, or would you have?
No, if I was seeing a port light, I'd have been turning the start, not across the bow.
There is a reason why you could have gone port rather than starboard, is because he was near the edge of the channel.
Yeah.
So he might have been concerned of himself running aground, but then do you make a decision about your ship, or knowing that you're going to have a total loss of the other ship and everyone in it? So it would be a decision.
Andrew, can I admit my misunderstanding, Riggs? This is about the unknown sailor. There was presumably a crew list for Goorangai.
Yep.
And are you saying that all the other crew members were somehow identified? Or is it just...
No. So there's only six recovered.
Oh, I see.
Seven brought to the surface. One of them floated away, and their boats were incapacitated. And someone got washed through the rip and gone, but 6 were recovered and buried, and 5 were identified. And the unidentified man, he was recovered 2 days after another man who'd been identified. So they could identify a man 2 days before. Don't know why they couldn't identify this one. They could have even taken measurements of things like arms and legs to determine the height of the fella. So I worked in some of my time in defence. I worked with small arms weapons, and there's well-known tables of the 99th percentile of people with particular size arm, and you can work out how tall they are. So those tables have been around for maybe 100 years. And those tables are important for design work, because otherwise you would have a gun that not everyone would be strong enough in the finger to press the trigger, for instance. You've got to have everyone, a large percentage of the population, able to do the basics of operating the equipment. So, yeah.
The other thing, sorry.
Was there any details of where the other bodies might have gone, or where they ended up, or anything like that come out in the inquiry?
Well, it didn't help that the salvage had turned into a demolition, and it was a massive demolition. So I worked out that they used explosive charges from mines, expired mines that were at Swan Island, and they used up to 30 of them. So it was tons of high explosive that they used. So anyone buried within the wreck might have been sort of blown apart. But for sure, there would have been people that entered the water on collision. So the Forecastle Party, for instance, they were travelling from Queenscliff to Point Nepean, and I'd suggest in a small ship they'd raise the anchor, and the Forecastle Party wouldn't bother standing down because they're going to be used in another few minutes, so they just stay there. So those ones most certainly would have ended up in the water.
The tidal stream, which you said was something like 7 knots, which
Can be up to 7 knots.
can be.
Mm.
Is it an incoming tide?
It was an ebb tide.
It's an ebb tide.
So so it's going up through the rip.
Okay.
Mm.
And there seemed to be an issue about vessel crabbing.
Yeah,
It was going across the outgoing tidal stream.
yeah.
Inevitably, it wouldn't be going in the straight line that he's pointing.
No.
It would be crabbing.
It would be crabbing, but their concept of the crabbing would have meant that it was like 45 degrees. It wouldn't have been anywhere near that, and that's why the Naval Board, the Marine Board didn't accept it. Was silly, and it wouldn't have been consistent either. That crabbing, it would have been all over the place. The steering system in those trawlers was mechanical, fully mechanical, and there was a lot of backlash in the steering yoke and the chains that went down the side of the ship. So yeah, it would have been a bit all over the place to steer. Yeah.
Andrew, just why was this investigation continued up until so recently? Is it a fair question that from when it happened in 1941 all the way through to 2000 there was still a discussion taking place, or have I missed something?
No, it was basically an accepted story, but the accepted story was sort of wrong, was biased towards the Melbourne Steamship Company. So after 1992, I'm not sure how many people have gone to the National Archive to look at the report. It's not digitised, for instance, so for me to see it, I had to go to Canberra. So it's only been from, as far as I know, me that's looked at it. I reckon, like a bit unusual while I'm a PO stoker. In my civilian job, I did staff course, an army staff course, and I think it would make an excellent project in staff course on all the things that can happen that you wouldn't do. There's hardly an aspect of the whole thing that was done properly. Yeah.
Thank you.
I find it strange that it's on a war, and also Port Phillip Bay in the Gap, and I've been at the ceremony for the Goorangai, and that gap is very small. I find it strange there was no traffic controller controlling the traffic going in and out of the bay, especially at the time of war.
So the Port War signal station, the reasons for them in being was that they challenged shipping coming both ways as to who they were. So with the coastal artillery, if they weren't able to explain who they were, the coastal artillery might ask them the question with something solid.
If you're a soldier and you're coming out from the bush, and someone will turn around and say, "Who are you?
Yeah, yep.
You know, what's your code?"
Yeah, so that's what the Port War signal station. Yeah, the Port War signal station did that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Where was that located?
So the Port War signal station, there was, yeah, the Port War signal station, there was one at Point Lonsdale, just near the the lighthouse that I showed you. And that's a really good spot. If you've ever been to that spot, you can look in Bass Strait and you can look down the bay.
Yeah.
It's an excellent spot. And there was also a Port War signal station at the battery observation point. And they'd ask people coming out of the bay where they were going and who they were, all that.
I think the point that you might be missing is that these signal stations knew who was in and out of the bay and knew who was there. They don't have the responsibility for the safe navigation of each of those vessels. That's the responsibility of the masters of the vessels. So they're not giving steering directions, if you like, to vessels coming in or going out. They've got to follow the navigational track. Commanding officer is responsible for keeping the boat safe, the ship safe.
I understand that being at sea, but being in a very small
No,
area like Port Phillip Bay,
still applies.
Still the
Right
case.
now.
Still the case.
still the case.
Yeah. So when they get, if you were to meet someone going out, you'd just pass port to port. Same
Any
rules.
port in the world, it's the same.
Same rules. But modern stuff these days makes it easy. So AIS and and
Well,
radar.
The other interesting point about this era, I'm pretty sure Duntroon didn't have radar.
No.
Yeah.
And so they couldn't, other than visual, they didn't really know what was out there.
And the idea that there was just one bridge watch keeper.
Yeah.
So if you start listing all the jobs he should be doing when he's coming to the end of a channel and he's about to make a nearly right-hand turn, and there's approaching shipping coming from port and starboard, he should have been really busy, and he would have had to answer the Port War signal station as well. They would have tapped out their code. So the whole idea that there was just one bridge watch keeper.
Because there was another collision after Goorangai during the Second World War.
The Duntroon was involved in another collision.
There was?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes.
With an American Navy ship, killed a number of people as well. But they weren't blamed for it. But I've never looked up the reasoning for it. But yeah. So my theory is sort of verified by other people that were recovered in particular places that you kind of expect them to be. With the unidentified sailor, he was recovered when they were working on the wardroom. All right, so I'd kind of worked out that it could be one of two people. But when I suggested that to the coroner wanted to know how I'd worked it out. And so I gave the coroner the information, and he said about that in particular, he said that wouldn't meet his standard of evidence. Just by sort of elimination. But yeah, but again, if you were trying to identify who he was, as a starting point, I would go to those two people's families. As a starting.
Then you're faced with DNA check of the body.
Yeah, but see, Sea-Power Centre say, exhumations and DNA, but there is something short of that they could do. So, for instance, I'm sure they've got more information about all the crew, and I'm sure that they could have a report done that was done about the fellow when he was recovered. I don't know for sure. Sea-Power Centre have a lot of stuff that they just don't make available to any man and his dog, and I have proof of that because of the two people that I thought that it could have been. A fellow from CPOW asked me whether I had an idea of who it might be, and I gave him those two names, and I said, "Have you got any medical records that aren't available to me through the National Archive on these two?" And he sent me some information. So I know that they have more that they won't share. So there is some things that are short of an exhumation, but the whole principle of it seems to be a thing where they say, oh, it's against policy. And because, and there is no policy.
What about the one that was buried at Williamstown only a few years ago? Did they do a DNA test on him?
He's the one.
That's the one, okay.
Yep.
Andrew, tradition has been so far that people who've spoken to us have gone away with a bottle of wine.
Oh yeah.
You look like a bloke who wouldn't necessarily want a bottle of wine.
Oh,
Brand new design.
all right.
Brand new design.
Okay.
Given you've devoted so much
Thank you.
of your life to this piece of noble history, I'd like to thank you, and I hope everybody else will.